This time, Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest. Take 2.
'Cause I'll stay a wild rover forever and more.
Hello and welcome to By Far the Greatest Team, a podcast in which fans attempt the impossible to rank once and for all who is the greatest team of all time. My name's Graham Dunn, as ever, making the case for Oxford United, and joining me for, unbelievably, it seems, the 100th time, it's Jamie Rooney.
It's quite a milestone, really, isn't it? And I think it's right that we're now doing Notts Forest as the director's cut and not the short story, as we thought we could sandwich it in our second episode with, I think, Queen's Park and somebody else, I forget.
So we were having some thought about how to celebrate our 100th episode, and we couldn't tempted by doing 100 teams or 100, something with a symbolism of 100. And then we thought, why not go back and think about some of the teams that, as you say, right in those early days, we had a concept where we could get through 3 teams an episode. And we quite quickly realised that these episodes were going to go on forever. The research was going to go on forever. It was becoming quite an undertaking. But so if you do listen to those first half dozen episodes or so, we did do 3 teams on them all. And one of them is Nottingham Forest, which feels a bit weird that we gave Nottingham Forest, Brian Clough, 1978, title winners, double European Cup winners, 15 to 20 minutes, and we gave Yeovil Town about 80 minutes. So time to fix that. Now, Jamie, I think it would be fair to say there was one episode where we saw the light, where we realised that maybe we were going to struggle for runtime.
I know where you're going. I'll let you come back in a second. You're doing yourself an injustice. So I think I originally pitched this idea to you that we'd kind of do 3 teams, and we have like the starter, the main course, and the dessert, and we try to spend 20 minutes on each team. And you at the very beginning called out, I like the idea, but can we really do that? And I was like, no, we can do this. And I think you kind of had your doubts from the very beginning. And I think when we were talking about episodes, I think you were very carefully and strategically lining up somebody who would blow that format out the window.
And step forward, the Sunderland FA Cup winners, 1973. I think I got the right year. Welcome back. We could have no one else on for this one, our 100th special. It was Phil Craig.
Oh, thank you, Graham. Hi, Jamie. Yeah, I do recall we spent 20 minutes discussing the 1972 winter influenza epidemic and how that led to a fixture backlog for Sunderland in 1973. And that might have been one of the contributory factors.
Do you know what? I love that moment, Phil. I really do love that moment, because I remember I did my research and I could see there was this big gap in fixtures where Sunderland hadn't played a game for God knows how long. And for the life of me, I couldn't work out why. And I just randomly asked you the question thinking, well, there's not going to be an answer to this. And you came back with the influenza, the detail of it. It was just fantastic. And it was like a pivotal moment about what this podcast potentially could be when you get proper people coming on and talking about teams.
I particularly remember trying to drag it back onto time by sort of trying to fast forward through to the final. And actually, I think it was you, Jamie. I don't think it wasn't you or Phil. I think it was James. I think we do need to go back to the 4th round. Oh my God! But also fitting to have you on, Phil, because I'm doing this without the actual data or the numbers, but I think you are probably our most regular guest. Would this be correct, Jamie?
You're absolutely correct. Phil is our most frequent visitor, and he's very welcome all the time, and he's brilliant. He's covered quite a good network of teams, but I think, I've worked it out, I think this is his 16th appearance on By Far the Greatest Team.
Wow, that's incredible. When you first came on, we only wanted to give you teams from the Northeast.
Yeah, we did Sunderland, West Auckland, and then you kind of let me just push the geography a bit further. We did a bit of Leeds. We did a bit of Italy, a bit of South America. You're still not convinced that the Great Arsenal Stadium Mystery is the best football film ever filmed, which I think you need some bit of convincing of that one. It's an excellent film. But yeah, very, very generous to let you join your podcast and ramble on and try and fit in Sunderland references whenever I can.
Well, you're not going to struggle on this one today, Phil. No. You're going to have plenty of opportunities.
Any other big data points from the 100 episodes, Jamie?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I mean, we've covered teams from almost 40 countries now, club and country. England leads the way. We've had almost 20 different guests on in between Phil's frequent visits. We've gone from minors to megastars to movies, as Phil's reference. We've covered clubs that never existed in the shape of Thames Valley Royals. We've covered clubs that we've made up completely, and we've asked FIFA and UEFA to consider having a barbarian team for future World Cup and Euro competitions. We've got Marseille, the most uncomfortable asterisks in football that we've covered, and I think it's a call out to the people that have really supported us from the beginning. You know, there's some great people that we know of that have kind of reached in touch with us: Martin Biggs, Paul Pitts, Ian Bennin, Keith Alderson. These great people that we know are listening, and thank you so much. And thank you for those I haven't mentioned as well. It could be that we just haven't heard from you, but then we heard from people like Gus, Benedict. And recently Stu, I'm the Aston Villa fan. And not only are they listeners, they've become guests. So the community, I feel, has grown, Graham. And it just feels like, you know, this is a weekly fixture I couldn't live without right now.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to name check Jamie Buckridge, who fabulously messaged me after the Peru one to point out, and this is a thing of beauty. We were explaining how much we all loved that Peru kit. And Jamie had gone, as a child, had gone and got the old Airfix paint out and had taken his, I think he thinks it's Derby County, which is possible, Derby County Sabutio team, and added a red stripe. Now, that is absolute genius.
That is fantastic.
But yes, so for the 100, we are going back to Nottingham Forest, Brian Clough. Phil, you are no stranger to Brian Clough because only a few weeks ago we did Brian Clough Derby County as part of our Derby County Heaven and Hell episode. Derby County is very much part one of this Brian Clough story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. He'd been manager of Derby County between 1967 and 1973. And after a slow start, Clough as manager and also another gentleman by the name of Peter Taylor as his assistant, we might touch on him, took Derby to the first division in 1969. They were champions, went 22 games without defeat. They won the league in 1971-72, and he then took the team to a European Cup the following season, 1972-73. They were knocked out in the semi-final, I think, by Juventus, rather controversially. Brian Clough was quite bitter about that defeat, thinking that it had been slightly fixed, and I think there's some evidence that points in that direction. He, and this is another theme that might come up again and again, he fell out with the board famously, and it's dramatised, of course, in this Damned United, as well as the next stage of his career. He had a brief hiatus at Brighton, and then he was appointed as Leeds manager in July 1974 after Don Revie had departed. I mean, it's incredible that he ever got that position because he'd been an outspoken critic of Leeds, Revie and the players. But for some reason, he was appointed, but it lasted just 44 days before he was sacked in September 1974. So by 1975, he wasn't in employment. He was a lot wealthier than he had been. He got a big payoffs from, particularly from guys from Leeds, but he was living as a bit of a semi-recluse, rarely leaving his house in Derby. And it's said, I think by Peter Taylor that he watched just one game of football between leaving Leeds and being appointed at Nottingham Forest. And that was a goalless draw between Stoke and Ajax in the UEFA Cup. And that was it. I don't know why he was watching that. So he'd been out of work, and it was a bit of a surprise, actually, when he was appointed as Nottingham Forest manager in January 1975, I think it was. I think he was considered a bit damaged goods. Obviously, he'd fallen out with the Derby board, and then the Leeds board was a pretty consistent theme there. He was closely associated with Derby County, near neighbours and rivals, of course. Nottingham Forest itself, and this is kind of setting the context, I think, for the success he had later, were 13th in Division 2, and home attendances had fallen to about 12,000. So, to be honest, at this point, Notts County, just over the Trent, were probably the bigger club rather than Nottingham Forest. And Nottingham Forest as a board, they had this really curious corporate structure of members rather than directors. It wasn't particularly kind of considered very strategic and hadn't made many bold choices. So it was an unusual, strange decision, one that was ultimately successful. But when he did turn up, he turned up in his Mercedes. He had made some money at Leeds United, even though he was just there for 44 days. And some of the first words he said when he became the manager, and this may be my first, it could be my last attempt at an impression, was I've left the human race and rejoined the rat race. Hope is all I can offer, which is a fantastic little phrase, isn't it?
Forest are an interesting side. To my mind, they hadn't done a huge amount, and they are obviously in a bit of a low point when he takes over. But actually, they had quite a sustained period in the top division, and they finished second at one stage, didn't they?
Yeah, 66, 67. They finished runners-up to Manchester United, which I was keen to kind of get in there and say. So that was the time when they didn't finish second. Manchester United went on and won the European Cup the following year, the first English team to do that. Thank you for the opportunity.
So it is the 100th. I suppose you should be allowed to do that. Yes, it's interesting you likening them not unlike Derby County, because it's fair to say Clough had unprecedented success at Derby County, and he does sort of decide it might be worth getting the band back together.
Yeah, that's right. There's one person, of course, we'll come on to who doesn't join him, at least initially. That's Peter Taylor. He's at Brighton. I think he's in the third division south at this point, so he's hardly kind of setting the world alight at this point. There's been a bit of a falling out, I think, between the two. Peter Taylor, I think, never felt that Leeds was a good option, and I think he was probably right in thinking that. And Brian Clough was disappointed that Peter Taylor hadn't joined him, and it probably contributed to his, failure at Leeds United as well, because not only was Peter Taylor had a very good eye for a player, but he was also much kind of conciliatory, kind of compared to obviously kind of Brian Clough. He could put his arm around a player, usually after he'd been riled by Brian Clough doing something out of this world along the way. But there were people who did join him. Jimmy Gordon joined him. He'd been a kind of a constant. You can see him in this damned United. I think they'd first come across each other years earlier when Brian Clough was playing for Middlesbrough, but he was kind of his kind of coach and did an awful lot of the kind of day-to-day training that took place on the pitch. And he ended up being first-team coach from 75 until 1980. He was also an ex-Forest player as well, so he knew his way around the ground as well.
I think it's worth pausing and just kind of bringing Jimmy Gordon into this, because we talk about the Clough-Taylor relationship and the chemistry they have, which is super important. But Jimmy Gordon is, unless you're a Derby County fan or not Forest fan, he's probably overlooked by the masses, and rather unfairly, because he was super important to the whole balance. While she had Clough, who was this kind of charismatic mouthpiece motivator and, with the big ideas in terms of the psychology of honing this team, you got Taylor, who's the incredible scout and eye for a talent generally, and then you've got Gordon, who's working with the players day to day. The players would say that his training was brutal but brilliant, and he was obedient, he was quiet. Even Brian Clough, I think himself, said that, for the amount of things that he could say, Jimmy Gordon's silence was way more powerful in the changing room. So Gordon, I think, deserves his place at the top table with Clough and Taylor. And it's good that we've kind of established that up front, because he is a key part, not just of what Clough and Taylor did at Derby County, but also what they go on and do in this miracle of 4 seasons at Nottingham Forest. I'm going to edit the knots out, that's for sure, because I don't want to get in trouble.
I know.
Yeah, I know that one.
I guess as well as Jimmy Gordon, he also kind of brought the band together as well. John McGovern, who obviously kind of went on to be absolutely central, working in kind of central midfield. He was signed from Leeds United again in 1975, just £50,000. And I think John O'Hare also kind of joined again from Leeds United. He was on a free, I think. And John O'Hare goes back to kind of Hartlepool days. So there was a good amount of loyalty. Taylor had a good eye for a player, but Brian Clough liked to have a few players who understood the way he operated and maybe would accept how he operated as well.
Yes, so McGovern and O'Hare, so he signs both of them for a third time. Archie Gemmell joins later from that Derby side. Colin Todd signs later from that Derby side. So a number of those players, just as he'd done previously, he goes back to players that he knows and trusts.
Yeah. I think that point you were saying there, Graham, is right. I've kind of slightly downplayed Nottingham Forest, 12,000 gates and mid-table, not really threatening being promoted. But he did inherit a kind of nucleus of some really, really good players as well, and we shouldn't overlook. So Viv Anderson was there. He was a homegrown talent. We know what happened to him. Brilliant fullback. There was also John Robertson as well. If there's ever a player who was central to the success of Nottingham Forest over the years we're going to talk about, it was John Robertson. He brilliant taking on a player, dribbling, massively creative player in the centre of, along the left wing, I think he was. I'm trying to think how he cut in against Hamburg. And there was also Ian Boyer as well, which probably he goes under the radar a little bit. He'd been signed from Manchester City, I think, in 1973. But it seemed like Ian Boyer was able to kind of play anywhere, and quite often, Clough would play him everywhere. And again, he kind of goes under the radar a little bit, but he was incredibly industrious. He'd work his kind of socks off. Quite smart, tactically kind of quite astute as well.
I'm laughing because Graham and I, prepping into this, we're just having a conversation, and Boyer popped up, and Clough Forest is very much 4-4-2. I mean, that's pretty obvious. He's got the pacey wingmen, he's got his big forwards, and he's got his central midfield. But Graham, we were confused about who was his central midfield, because there seems to be all manner of players playing in the middle of the park. But it probably wasn't the case, because Martin O'Neill, we always thought was a central midfielder, but sometimes he played out on the right of midfield as well. You got McGovern in there and Boyer in there as well. So yeah, it's there was flexibility, I think.
There's one or two others, but the John Robertson isn't really doing anything by his standards at the time when Brian Clough first comes in that season, and it's similar for Tony Woodcock, and it's really then
Martin O'Neill as well. I think he's in that band as well. I think they're kind of labouring along in the reserves. They're not really considered first team players, I think.
He keeps Derby up, and then I think in the first full season in charge, they finish 8th. It's in the summer he persuades Peter Taylor to come in, and I think Taylor's words to him are, "With that team you've done it, it's a miracle you finished 8th."
And they're 7 points off a promotion place, so they're getting closer. And it's 76. Of course, we all know that the team that's promoted as champions that year is, of course, Sunderland. I just thought I'd just drop that in, just the first of many. But they finished the season. There was momentum kind of building at the end of 76, and they finished the season with 8 straight home wins. At the same time, in 1976, Taylor, as you mentioned, Graham, was at Brighton, but they finished a point off promotion in Division 3. I think Taylor probably thought he'd kind of taken Brighton as far as he could. I think he enjoyed living in Brighton. He was there, on the seafront, nice place and everything. But it was at that point that there was a rapprochement between the two. And Taylor came in and he started looking at the squad.
And it's Taylor who is pretty instrumental in turning around. I think he gets John Robertson to lose some weight. I think he reinvents Martin O'Neill. And in particular, he decides that Tony Woodcock, who's like a struggling midfielder, I think, might have a better future up front.
Yeah, I think there's a story that Clough isn't sure about Tony Woodcock, so he sends him out on loan to Doncaster. And while he's out on loan, he gets an approach from somebody you've written and spoken about recently, Graham and Jamie, Graham Taylor, who at that point was the Lincoln manager. Brian Clough thought a lot of Graham Taylor and his knowledge of the game, and he thought, basically, if Graham Taylor thinks this is a decent player, maybe he is a decent player, and I'm going to bring him back. And he started kind of giving him games. Tony Woodcock, I think, famously was, I think it was on some like his Clough's first day or one of maybe his first week. They were all eating lunch before an FA Cup replay, and they were stationed themselves at Bisham Abbey, not too far away from us. And he's eating his dinner, and Clough comes along and says to Tony Woodcock, "Here's my key. Go and clean my shoes." And Tony Woodcock's a bit baffled by this. He goes, "But boss, I'm eating my dinner." And Brian Clough says, "Look, I might be stupid, but I'm not blind. You've finished your dinner." And Tony Woodcock, he was on his way, cleaning his boots along the way. But and it's just like one of the first, and there's many examples of the way in which he'd, in a sometimes a kind of slightly perverse way, he'd kind of win over players by kind of all kinds of different tricks.
He does something similar to Archie Gemmell. Well, at the same time, he leaves him out of the European Cup final squad, and I don't think Archie Gemmell takes it quite as well.
No, he has a few run-ins. Yeah,
they also bring in a couple of key players that become stalwarts for that short period. One of them's Larry Lloyd, who has obviously been at Liverpool. I think they get him from Coventry City, but I think he's had a spell at Liverpool. And they bring in the youngster Peter Wibb as well, which is like that kind of classic number 9. The fees they paid were really ridiculously cheap as well. I think you got both of those players for less than £100,000. I mean, as we know from our Derby County podcast, that Brian Clough didn't always go to the board for approval. He would just generally go out and sign players and then worry about how the clubs were going to pay for those players afterwards.
Yeah, and they got up front. Then you had a really good partnership. You could have Tony Woodcock just playing off Peter West. Peter West, a big kind of strong target man, and then Tony Woodcock had the intelligence to kind of work around him and find space and good positions around him. And then Larry Lloyd, who I suppose more famous when he had been at Liverpool, was an example of him picking up an older player, as he'd done with kind of famously with Roy Mackay at Derby, but picking up an older player who still had the ability. He might not be as kind of quick as he was, but Larry Lloyd never really depended upon kind of pace, did he? So he had that intelligence. And he was tactically very, very astute. Larry Lloyd and Brian Clough had a few kind of run-ins, and Larry Lloyd said of Brian Clough, I think to his face, I think you were a brilliant manager, but if you walked into the pub, I'd walk out. And it's never kind of quite clear how you can have a kind of quite a large degree of antagonism between Brian Clough and a player, and yet that player would go on to play some of their best football they'd play in their whole career.
Yeah, that is quite surreal, isn't it?
How did he motivate them? How did he do that?
So Forest get promoted at the end of that 76-77 season, but they don't. But it's not like they romp home. They actually kind of scrape through in third place.
Yeah, I think they were 5 points off Wolverhampton, who were the champions, and 1 clear of Bolton. So it was pretty clear. But another thing, it doesn't happen anymore, does it now? All of the games happen at the same time. But, you go back to the 70s, there'd be teams finishing weeks before anybody else. So Forest had finished and they had to wait for all the results to come in. And so Brian Clough takes the team off to Mallorca. So they're in a post-season break in Mallorca when they hear that they'd been promoted.
There seems to be 2 common themes in English football in the 1970s. One, the season never finished at the same time. There would be random games that would complete the season. And 2, the moment you had finished your season, you're on the very first flight off to Mallorca. It seems to be the 2 key themes that would happen with football teams in the English top flight and second tier, as we're finding out with Forest.
Definitely. So Forest get promoted. Pretty much he's emulating what he did at Derby. It's taken him a year longer than it did at Derby to get Forest up, but he has got them promoted. Extraordinarily, Forest achieved something which pretty unusual, which is to win the title in the first year after being promoted.
It's rare, but it does happen. We know from Ipswich Town, when we did Ipswich Town with the great Mark Horrocks, Ipswich Town got promotion from the second tier, and they went on and won the top tier under Sir Alf Ramsey. Tottenham Hotspurs did it in 49-50, and then they went on and won the league in 50-51. And both Liverpool and Everton have done it in the early period of time. Probably the most famous one outside of English football is FC Kaiserslautern, who won the second Bundesliga title in the late 1990s and then went straight on under the great Otto Rehagel. And who knows, we may visit that team in the very near future. And they won the Bundesliga. And it's happened in Sweden a few times. It's happened in Norway a few times. So it does happen that teams win the second tier of the professional leagues and go on immediately to win the top tier, but it doesn't happen that often. It's hard to really think of it being something that can happen nowadays. I think it would just be the most modern miracle in football these days, because the way that football is so controlled, and the especially if you think about the difference, but well, Phil could argue this is not the case between the Championship and the Premier League. Generally, teams that come up from the Championship struggle in the Premier League, as we've seen in the last 2 seasons in English football. Obviously, there's a team at the moment that's come up from the Championship that's knocking that trend.
Yeah, I could talk about that a lot if you want to, but yeah, this is going off on a divergent now. Sunderland have got the most points we've had at the beginning of a top flight season since 1969. But as we all know, the history of football, in 68-69, Sunderland just managed to avoid relegation in that season. So, you've got to be very kind of cautious about that. I think the comparisons and contrasts with Derby are really interesting because Derby had made a similarly impressive start to the season, but they got up to Christmas, and they kind of faded away after Christmas. Probably Nottingham Forest peaked around kind of Christmas time, and I think they thumped, Man United 4-0 at Old Trafford. I think Dave Sexton was the manager at that point, and he said he couldn't believe it. It was like Nottingham Forest had 16 players on the pitch. He couldn't believe it. Maybe the big difference between Derby County and Nottingham Forest in 78 was, although we think of free-flowing football with Clough and Nottingham Forest, that is true, but up to a point. In a season where you got 2 points for a win and 1 point for a draw, they pretty much kind of got a lead and then held it. They drew lots of games. There were lots of 0-0 draws. They were incredibly compact and ground out the results that got them to a pretty kind of comprehensive kind of championships. They were 7 points clear of Liverpool, and of course Liverpool that year would have won the European Cup as well. They lost just 3 games and conceded 24 goals. They scored quite a few goals, but they only conceded 24 goals. And maybe part of the explanation for that was improvements in midfield. This was the point at which they brought in Archie Gemmell, but they also brought in Kenny Burns, play alongside Larry Lloyd. Kenny Burns was a striker. I think he came from Birmingham, was played as a striker, but Taylor and Clough saw something in him and thought they could play him as a centre-back instead. Kenny Burns famously with the missing teeth as well, kind of tactically take his teeth out and kind of intimidate other players.
That's not the only thing I think he takes out as well, as Perrin can probably tell us.
All right, going for that.
Kenny Burns and his testicle, a fabulous photo, which you can see rather more of Kenny Burns than you might ever want to.
I've missed that in my research.
Kenny Burns, there's a picture of him. I think he's in the classic footballer position. I think he's holding one ball and there's another ball on show, or the best part of it. It's quite something.
I'm going to Google that.
Kenny Burns signs, but I mean, he's got a bit of a reputation, doesn't he, as a bit of a wild man of football, and so Peter Taylor does his homework on him, doesn't he?
He does. It's a bit ironic as well, isn't it? Because Kenny Burns had this reputation for drinking and gambling, not as if like Peter Taylor or Brian Clough didn't have a bit of a history around gambling and drinking, but Peter Taylor decides to follow him before they sign him, and he goes to a dog track and he reports back and says, yes, he gambled, yes, he drunk, but in moderation, he'll be absolutely fine. So he did his due diligence, years before Alex Ferguson was kind of tailing young players to the girlfriend's or party's house. He was right on top of it.
As you say, they convert Kenny Burns into a centre-back from a centre-forward. It is absolutely extraordinary. So Kenny Burns, I think he's capped at something like 20 times for Scotland, and he wins his first caps for Scotland in about 74, 75 as a striker. So he is called up the first time as a striker, and then a few years go past, and then he's called up again as a centre-back. Now, I know players have played different positions for countries before and been and moved around during their career, but it feels really odd to me. I can't imagine another player who essentially gets picked in 2 different roles in 2 different stages of his career.
No, I don't think there is. I mean, I did a little bit of prep on this, and I'll be absolutely appreciative if anyone's listening to this and they know of a player who's been capped internationally playing in 2 polar positions, basically as a forward, a centre forward, and a central defender. Now, we know with the English League, Dion Dublin, Chris Sutton, Paul Warhurst, they all played in that central defender, centre forward position in their careers. But I don't think any of them actually played for the England national team in both positions. I think they were identified as one position, I think pretty much as a forward, maybe in Paul Warhurst, and he has the odd cap or 2 anyway, but I think he was there as a kind of a central defender. I think Kenny Burns is certainly unique.
But Kenny Burns is an incredible signing for Forest, and he wins the Football Writers Player of the Year for that season. Now, they also sign Peter Shilton. When we're talking about their strong defensive side, Peter Shilton is obviously an absolutely central part of that.
I'm looking at my notes, and I still can't quite believe it. It must be a typo, but I put down that in the title, Is it? It can't be 37 clean sheets. I'm going to ignore that. It can't be right. But it was, if you managed to get past Kenny Burns and Larry Lloyd, then you were faced by this kind of huge physical presence. And Brian Clough himself describes these kind of his broad shoulders and his kind of muscular body in quite detail, I think, in his kind of autobiography. And for a manager who rarely kind of spoke favourably of players, he consistently spoke favourably of Peter Shilton.
I think it's that he concedes 18 goals in 37 games for Forest, which is quite something. Enough for Shilton to be voted the Footballers' Player of the Year that year. So it's quite impressive business. Again, I can't think this would happen very often where you make two of your signings to improve the club. He makes pretty much in the first couple of months of that season, and they go on to win the two biggest awards in the game, individual players. So you can see the impact that those two players alone have had.
Shilton wins you matches. I mean, this is such a key signing. I mean, Gemmell coming in and Burns coming in, because Burns obviously forms a partnership with Larry Lloyd, and that becomes central to the success of this football team. But I think having Shilton behind him, and Phil, you're not far off. I think 24 clean sheets that Shilton kept, but that was in the following season. That was in the 78-79 season, and I think it's part of the run that we may talk about as well. But 24 clean sheets in a single season it's incredible. I mean, this is a 46-game season, so over 50% of the games, Peter Shilton's kept a clean sheet. Yeah, I think it's incredible. I mean, other than facing penalties, which I do have a problem with Peter Shilton, because I just think he's watching him for England, and maybe I saw him at the back end of his career. He just seems slow and stationary. He is an absolute world-class goalkeeper at this point. I mean, they picked him up from Stoke for a fairly hefty fee for the time, 325,000, I think it was.
Record fee for the goalkeeper. Brian Clough isn't afraid of spending record transfer fees, something that Dave Sexton and Man United are afraid of doing, because they're interested in Shilton and won't spend the money.
Why, when you've got, Gary Bailey coming through, why would you? Yeah, I mean, Brian Clough is not afraid to spend any club's money, to be honest. I mean, as long as it's not coming out of his pocket, I don't think he doesn't really care of the cost. But yeah, I mean, Shilton, they put a lot of money behind him to get him from Stoke, and I think this is one of the key signings. The success you're going to see for Forest in the next 3 seasons is underpinned by having probably one of the best goalkeepers in the league at that time, potentially the world. Peter Shilton did have a great peak around the 1970s to the mid 1980s.
Now there is one other thing that Brian Clough takes from the Derby County playbook and puts into operation for this golden period with Nottingham Forest. As we remember from the Derby County episode, the success of Derby County begins with the winning of the Texaco Cup in 71-72. And if we look at Forest, now the Football League Cup, they go on to be unbelievable, and that's their first sort of bit of silverware under Forest, but actually it's not their first silverware. Phil, or Jamie, do either of you want to talk about the Anglo-Scottish Cup?
For Jamie.
I mean, the links between the Anglo-Scottish Cup and the Texaco Cup, I mean, they are brother and sister, or brother and brother. I mean, they're very close. So it's really born out of the Texaco Cup. The sponsorship or whatever it was for Texaco when they were putting all of their gas stations, petrol stations in the UK and doing this big promotion through football, that's come to an end. But the Cup hasn't come to an end. So it's a competition between English teams and Scottish teams. No longer Northern Ireland and Ireland are participating. And essentially it's for your top tier, lower end teams, teams that aren't featured in Europe generally, will compete. You'd have 4 teams from Scotland and 4 teams from England. But the format sometimes was that the English would have a number of teams that would compete. So you'd have to win a particular group. And Forest do play in 76, 77. And I think Brian Clough is taking this serious. I don't think he's looking at this as just a competition that takes place in the preseason as well. I should add. So it's not happening during the season. It happens as a preseason. So I think it's an opportunity for him to kind of blood his team and to get them into the winning mentality from the very beginning. They take it serious. They top their group, and then they go into effectively a quarterfinal where they play Kilmarnock, and they come through that They then beat Ayr United in the semi-final, and they're faced with the mighty, it says Orient, but I like to know as Leighton Orient. I mean, come on.
They were Orient for a period, weren't they? They did drop the Leighton for slightly insanely for a bit.
They did. And it's during this period where they're Leighton less that Forest play them. And beat them very comfortably, actually, 5-1 on Ankara. And they become the 1976-77 Anglo-Scottish champions. The final was actually played in December. So just a correction on my part. It wasn't always a pre-season. There were games played, but I think they were played over the European ties that were been played. I like to think that Brian Clough is getting his team ready for success. I think this plays into the psychology and the mentality of what Brian Clough is trying to build. He was very proud to say that Nottingham Forest had won that competition. And I think it plays to the narrative that he's a very serious individual when it comes to winning trophies.
Which he further demonstrates as Nottingham Forest win the Football League Cup, their first bit of silverware. Now, this is pretty extraordinary period, actually. The Forest are quite free scoring in this tournament in a way that maybe they aren't in the league. But at the back, they are indebted to a star performance pretty much through every game. He plays 7 of the 8 games in goal. Has a star performance in the final, in particular against Liverpool, the first leg, which goes to a replay. And it is one Chris Woods. Now, Jamie, again, there's something pretty unusual about Chris Woods and Nottingham Forest.
Chris Woods was 18 years old when he played. So, he's quite unique that he's only played a handful of games for Nottingham Forest. He's won a trophy and he's never represented Nottingham Forest in the league. I think that's what you're angling for, Graham. Did I get that right or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is part of a weird era, though, of goalkeepers who were kind of number twos who kind of come from nowhere and end up having starring roles in major cups. So obviously Nigel Spink is Aston Villa's reserve keeper to Jimmy Rimmer, and he plays, I think, in the European Cup final there. And Tony Parks comes on after, I think, does he start or come on as a substitute in Spurs Cup Winners' Cup or UEFA Cup final? One of the European finals they were in at the time. A highlight of Tony Park's career before, of course, he had a loan spell at Oxford United, the lucky chap. But yeah, they winning the League Cup does begin a kind of rivalry with Liverpool, who this appears to be a rivalry that Brian Clough takes better than his rivalry with John Reevey in Leeds. Now, it's worth saying that the league season is going spectacularly well at this point, and there's a key game on the 26th of November, which is, I think, the last time that Nottingham Forest lose for 42 games. So Forest embark on this incredible run, and Phil, you kind of talked about this earlier. That actually they don't lose games. They don't, they're not afraid of drawing games. So I think when I looked at it, it's a 42 game run, which covers, straddles both seasons. But I mean, they win 21 and draw 21. It's just this unprecedented run of not losing.
Yeah, am I right? Is it November 1977 to December 1978 and 42 games unbeaten? It ended, and this kind of goes back to that rivalry point, it ended in December 1978 with a 2-0 defeat to Liverpool at Anfield. At the time, this was the longest unbeaten run in English top-flight history. I think it surpassed Arsenal's kind of post-war records, and it stood for over 20 years before it was overtaken by Arsenal's 49-game Premier League run between 2003 2004.
I wasn't sure about that Arsenal thing. I had it that actually the record was previously held by one Don Reevey and Leeds United, but I might be wrong.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was Burnley.
Well, do you know what? We will do our research during the break, and we will come back after the break with the answer of that on that one, and we will go on to talk about Nottingham Forest and some European glory.
Wow. Here we are, 100 episodes, by far the greatest team football podcast. It's been an incredible journey through football history, and Graham and I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who's listened, shared, and supported the show, wherever you are in the world, from London to Dublin, Glasgow to Lisbon, Melbourne to Mexico City. Your messages, reviews, and passion for the game mean the world to us. And a huge thank you also to the amazing guests who's joined us along the way. Their stories, insight, and humour have made the show what it truly is. Next week, we release our 103rd episode, and we'll also be launching the brand new, by far the greatest team website, a proper home for the podcast, packed with stories, stats, images, and loads of extra content you won't find anywhere else. More details to come next week, but trust me, you'll want to check it out. And here's to the next 100 episodes. A few new adventures along the way, including our very own YouTube channel. We'll be bringing some of our classic episodes from our back catalogue to life, along with weekly drops of new episodes. So thanks again for being part of the journey. By far the greatest team. We're only just getting started.
So welcome back. We are on our 100th ever episode. We're going back, revisiting Nottingham Forest 1977 through to 80 or something, or that period, the Brian Clough years. For our 100th episode, this one could very well end up being 100 minutes because we've done and a half and we sort of sped through them, winning the title, the most incredible achievement. Before the break, we were talking about this run of 42 games. I've deliberately not listened back to our first episode on this since we did it, but I think I remember drawing a parallel because the first episode of, or the first radio series of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is broadcast during this. So Nottingham Forest are about halfway through this 42 game run when deep thought is posing the ultimate question to the ultimate answer, or the ultimate answer of 42 to the ultimate question. I can't remember which way around it is. And so I like to think that in the same way as the Earth was busy going through a live experiment to discover what the question was, the answer 42, the football was doing that its own thing with Brian Clough going through that same period at the same time. Before the break, we left you with the tease that the 42 game record beat which team. Now we had a pre-war Arsenal team in the mix, we had Burnley in the mix, and we had Don Reevy's Leeds United. Jamie?
I think my blinkers of being a Manchester United fan came full into operation, and I just completely disregarded Leeds United, which was a foolish thing to do because absolutely, Graham, you nailed it. It was Leeds United, not Burnley, not this obsession that Phil has with pre-war Arsenal.
Brian Clough, I'm sure, would have taken no added enjoyment from taking a record off Don Reevy in any way whatsoever.
Very true.
So at Nottingham Forest, we're going to sort of focus a bit more on the European stuff, I think, in this half. It's worth saying that unbeaten record stretches through until, as you say, Phil, the December of that year. And it means that, I mean, Forest are collecting more draws at this point. When they do eventually lose, as you say, they lose to Liverpool, and they do eventually lose their crown to Liverpool. So Liverpool win the league that following season, 78-79. But curiously, in both seasons, Forest only lose through games.
Yeah, I think it's incredible, isn't it? I mean, they're pretty much dominant, and the only team that can really stop them is Liverpool. So 8 points, Liverpool were the champions. Forest finished second, 8 points off Liverpool. But this is, an incredibly strong Liverpool team. I think it's still Bob Paisley at this point, isn't it? Who kind of, were incredibly dominant. And it's only Forest who can kind of really, really kind of touch them at this point, I think.
And Liverpool are not only dominant in the home game, they are dominant in Europe. So they have won the European Cup 2 years running. They've won the European Cup in 77 and 78. They would be favourites to win it in '79, I would imagine. And I think they changed the rules after this. This is a point where there was only presumably actually it's quirk of fate that there are two teams in there anyway, only because Liverpool are the holders, maybe. There are two English sides, but not only are Liverpool and Nottingham Forest in the European Cup, they are drawn together in the first round.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, this is back in the day where the European Cup was just a straight knockout, and seedings was not something that was established as the norm. So yeah, it was a straight draw. And whilst you got teams in the hat from Iceland and Luxembourg and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and Cyprus, out of the hat comes two English teams, the only two English team cup. It has happened a few times. Because you do get a team that wins the European Cup from one nation and they don't win the leagues. But yeah, so Forest and Liverpool are going head-to-head. And this really plays into the narrative of this rivalry that's been building. Not only are they going head-to-head in the league for these two successive seasons, they've faced off in this League Cup that's gone to a replay where the young Chris Woods, filling in for the cup-tied Peter Shilton, has been a superstar at 18 years old. Then, incredibly, these two teams face each other in the very first round of the European Cup. And you're probably thinking as well, I mean, it's hard because I don't remember this period, but you would have been thinking that surely the winners of this is going to have a free ride all the way through to the final. It almost feels like this is the final in terms of drawing each other in the first round.
This also shows, I mean, Forest do sign players. Bizarrely, they signed Jim Montgomery in the summer. I can't quite believe. I mean, Phil, I mean, Jim Montgomery was about 35 when he played in that cup final, wasn't he?
I think he first got into the Sunderland team mid-60s, maybe 65. So he was. I mean, obviously he's the preeminent goalkeeper of that generation, isn't he? So Forest are lucky to have him, really. But yeah, I mean, it was an incredible time for goalkeepers as well, because we mentioned Chris Woods, who went on to have an excellent career as well. Facing off against Liverpool, you had Ray Clemence as well. And am I right in thinking there was a point at which England managers thought it was a good idea to just kind of swap between the two because they couldn't make their mind up?
Yeah. What's intriguing, Clough has always liked a big striker. He's always had a big number 9 up there. And Peter With, who's scored a hatful of goals in the title-winning thing, mostly getting on the end of John Robertson crosses. Peter With is the number 9, and he sells him during the summer. There's another player, I think, whose name escapes me, who they initially think might be the new number 9, and then instead he just chucks a line to Gary Birtles, a guy pretty much unheralded before here, who scores his first ever goal, I think, in that Liverpool game, doesn't he?
All they had to do was pay the compensation, £2,000 compensation to Long Eaton United. I think it's a bit of a kind of a quirk of fate, really, because I think Peter Taylor had gone along to watch somebody else, and then Birtles caught his eye. Birtles was a carpet fitter, part-time at the time, classic part-time footballer, and I think Taylor was just convinced that this is the guy that they had to pick up. So I don't know who somebody else was that Peter Taylor went along to watch, but they came away with a man who absolutely knows how to wear facial furniture. Go back to this more serious point. I think it's his third appearance for Nottingham Forest when he plays against Liverpool in the game at Forest at home first, yeah?
City Ground. I don't know.
City Ground. Yeah, 2-0 City Ground.
So it's his third game when he plays against Liverpool at the City Ground. He doesn't look out. I mean, I've only watched the highlights. He doesn't look out of place. And he's got that kind of air of mystery and excitement about him as well. And he really causes Liverpool a number of problems in that critical first game.
I think it's extraordinary when you think about this. You have a guy who pretty much comes from nowhere, totally unheralded. Now he's playing for the league champions. He ends the season, scores 26 goals in 54 games. I think it says a lot for the Forest system, the way they play. He's the number 9 at the end, but Birtles sort of comes from nowhere, and Forest dump Liverpool out of the cup. And now that, through the prism of what goes on to happen, which is Forest winning 2 European Cups, that doesn't seem odd. But this would have been a surprise result in many ways, because this is Forest's first ever appearance in the European Cup. Is that right?
Yeah, of course it is. You know, they've won the championship for the first time, the league championship, and yeah, they're rightfully in the European Cup. Yeah, so their very first appearance in European Cup, and they play the holders, Liverpool, in the first round. And, you know, just back on Bertels there. I mean, this is definitely his golden period. It wasn't, unfortunately, when he went to Manchester United. I think he was a shadow of himself. But it's not that he just scores these 26 goals in a season for Forest. He creates so many opportunities for Woodcock and Francis to score goals as well, because he kind of has such a busy nature about him. His movement is sensational. He's not just your classic number 9. He's almost like a 9, what we call a 9.5, I guess, these days.
Absolutely. Now, you've mentioned him, Trevor Francis. We shouldn't ignore what a massive thing this was. So Forest are, they're not a particularly rich club necessarily, or not necessarily got rich backers, but as we discussed on this pod a few times before, it's a much more democratic league. So anyone can win the league, and that's been demonstrated. Obviously, with Forest winning, but with Derby winning with the count. There was that run of 20-odd years where no team retains the league title. There's a real democracy about it. And one of the things you see is that the big signings are not always by the teams you expect. Evident, Forest are the ones who broke the transfer record for a goalkeeper in signing Peter Shilton the year before, and now they break the transfer record and they go the whole way. And so Trevor Francis becomes the first £1 million player.
I'll keep going back to Brian Clough. He's such a kind of fascinating character, but I'm not sure if you can get this on YouTube or see it, but I think I've read that Nottingham Forest are announcing the signing of Trevor Francis. They're holding a press conference, and in comes Brian Clough, as he quite often did. He had a kind of a tracksuit on, and he was holding a squash racket, and he spoke a little bit about the deal, how excited he was, and he just said he'd nipped out for a game of squash and picked up a player on the way. I have the feeling that they tried to kind of play slightly less, or the actual fee was slightly less than £1 million, but with add-ons it was clearly over £1 million, partly just to take some of the pressure off not being like the first £1 million player, but he clearly was the first £1 million player. Yeah, well, it kind of pays off, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And Clough protects him from the start. Because I think Clough, whether he's holding a squash racket or not, he actually said that, you know, I've signed this player for £999,999. I can't do it. I shouldn't do it, really. It's really bad. I'm really sorry, Graham. Yeah, so Clough's already protecting his special talent.
You say he's protecting him. I mean, one thing you might do if you spent £1 million on a player for the very first time is you might play him in his right position.
It's bizarre, isn't it? It really is bizarre. There are rare occurrences of this happening. I mean, obviously, we've spoken about Kenny Burns, who moves into a different position and it works because he's got a partnership. And there was a time when Johan Cruyff played Gary Lineker, an absolute number 9 and nothing else, on the right wing at Barcelona. It's almost like, you know, I'm putting you there because I don't want you in the team, and hopefully you'll work it out yourself. But yeah, Francis going out wide just doesn't seem to. When you look at Trevor Francis as the football player, I only really caught him at the back end of his career when he was kind of, you know, through QPR, and then when he came a Sheffield Wednesday player manager. He was always, for me, a classic number 9. He was a goal scorer. He was a threat in the 6-yard box. But yeah, Clough seems to fancy him out wide, where he's got great options already.
Is it partly because Clough had been a striker and such a successful striker? So he was kind of quite critical of players, and he'd obviously want to kind of put them down a peg or two. But all the way through Francis's career at Forest, Clough seems to have misgivings about him, and there's attempts to sell him. I think at one point they intended to sell him, or were close to selling him to Barcelona, but he failed a medical or something like that. But I do have another little kind of vignette, a little story about after Trevor Francis has signed for £1 million for Nottingham Forest from Birmingham. And his first game, I think this is an example of Clough taking a player down a peg or two, but his first game was in the A team, so that would be the third choice team. And he's playing in a Parks pitch in front of 40 fans, and that's his first game for Forest. And Clough told him off for not wearing shin pads, pointing out he'd paid a lot for those legs and he didn't want them being damaged. Yeah, so, you know, never let a £1 million player get above his station.
So he joins, I think it's December time, or maybe even after that. Forest, the winning run, the unbeaten run has come to an end, and Forest, as we discussed, don't retain the title. They do retain the League Cup. beating Southampton 3-2 in quite an entertaining final. And they do make it all the way to the final of the European Cup. Now, this seems such a weird thing. Trevor Francis is unable to play in any of those European games because he has to wait 3 months to be allowed to play for Forest in Europe. That period runs out just in time for him to play in the final itself against Malmo. And Trevor Francis makes his European debut in the final.
He does, but I think we should backtrack a little bit because to get to the final, they've got to go through rounds. They've beaten Liverpool, they beat Athens, they beat Grasshoppers, and then they are faced against Cologne in the semi-final. And Cologne at the time, FC Cologne, are a pretty tidy team. And it's quite apt, really, that we haven't spoken about one of the central players through this podcast so far, because Günter Netzer famously said in this semi-final between FC Cologne and Nottingham Forest, which finished, I think, 3-3 the first game, who is this McGovern? I've never heard of him, yet there he is running the game. And it's quite apt that we haven't really spoken about John McGovern, who's one of, or arguably the most important player, maybe other than John Robinson, in this team, because he is the metronome. He is the one that's kind of moving the team. He's dictating the pace. So it's quite funny that Günter Netzer is suggesting, who is this John McGovern? And here we are talking about this great Forest team, and we haven't even mentioned John McGovern.
Yeah, the captain of the side.
Am I right in thinking John McGovern didn't go to the 1978 World Cup because nobody in the Scottish setup thought he was Scottish?
Wow. I mean, that's another mark for Ali McLeod, isn't it, really? I mean, this is the guy who did his research.
Yeah, they thought John McGovern, they didn't spot he was Scottish. I think that's true.
I think McGovern has probably been underestimated his whole career. He wins the title with Derby County, gets eventually picked up by Leeds, and then leaves Leeds to go and join second division Nottingham Forest. Now, I know there's an attraction, the two of them being reunited, but it's as if no one else sees any value in him.
That's a tough fixture, Cologne. They have to come from behind Forest. I think they're 3-1 down, and they have to come back to make it 3-3, and then they win the second leg.
Just another little one there that they've drawn 3-3, so semi-final, and they're away in the second leg. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty in the Forest changing room, and even Clough and Taylor. But Cologne lose 5-1 to Bayern Munich the weekend before the second leg, and that builds a fair amount of confidence, not just in the players, but also in Peter Taylor, who decides to put £1,000 on Forest to win the second leg. I'm not sure how ethical that is.
The Peter Taylor that was worried about Kenny Burns' gambling habits.
So they get through to the final where they play Malmo. Now, that's a pretty underwhelming final when it comes to Europe on the one hand, and we'll do Malmo at some point separately, I think, because I think it's a really interesting story. But this is the only time, I think it's still the only time a Swedish side has got to the final of the European Cup. So Nottingham Forest are pretty unknown in terms of European competition, and Malmo are really unknown in terms of European competition. And the final itself, I think, is really pretty underwhelming as well.
It's the one goal from Trevor Francis, isn't it?
Yes.
And I'm just looking up because I'm pretty sure Malmo had an English manager at the time. Was it Bob Howson?
It's Bob Howson. Bob Howson is in charge.
Yeah. Good friend of the great, God, my memory, England manager.
Are you going to say Roy Hodgson? Because this Malmo
great Roy Hodgson, yeah.
There's a great axis between Malmo, Houghton, Hodgson, and one of their other managers is one Tord Grip.
Wow, really? Friend of Sven.
Sven's friend. So a lot to be done with that. But yes, this is Trevor Francis's mic drop moment. Despite playing on the right wing, he does get the all-important winner. And Nottingham Forest, just as they had in their first season back in the top flight, had won it. Now in their first season in the European Cup, they have won it. And this probably is the point at which this team usurps what's been achieved at Derby. Now, actually, as we discussed, they go on, they very nearly have some European glory themselves, Clough at Derby, but it doesn't work here. But what is really evident about Brian Clough and this Nottingham Forest, or Brian Clough at this stage, is he is a much more settled figure. And I think, Jamie, you've talked a bit about this on the last podcast, about how he recognised how immature he was at Derby County. And Brian Clough is still a massive personality, and he is still on the television a bit, but actually that's all been reined in. And, Brian Clough, the TV personality, is nothing like what he was before. And Brian Clough, the shouter at chairman, is also nothing like he was, because I don't think, I don't get any indication that he was ever at war with the Forest board. It might be that no one really knew who was in charge of Forest.
I think if you're a football manager and you take a team that's had a very modest history up into the top flight and you win it immediately, and then you go into the European Cup for the very first time and you win it immediately, I think it's going to change the relationship of the board. I mean, what is there to criticise?
Well, it didn't at Derby, though.
Yeah, but at Derby, you're right, though. He didn't, yeah, but he had a very mixed relationship with Jim Broadbent. It just didn't work with Jim Broadbent.
I think he did have a good relationship with the then chairman at the time. Bit of an example of the difference between now and then. I think the chairman at the time had some money, but largely by running 2 post offices, so not a huge amount of money. I think he got in a bit of bother with some issues with the accounts at the post office, and this is pre-Horizons and Fujitsu involvement, and went to court. And quite regularly, Brian Clough would be in the court to support his then chairman. So as well as being slightly antagonistic, and particularly with the board at Derby, there was a certain degree of loyalty and even friendship that kind of developed. I don't think it was perfect. I think there was still a little bit of falling out that went on with the board or certain members of this strange corporate structure they have. And he'd sometimes get quite frustrated and fed up with the Forest supporters as well, partly because of sometimes their perceived lack of support for the team. He was winning all these trophies and they weren't necessarily selling out every game. And then the other thing, I think there was the beginnings of some of the issues, the financial pressures that build up later, because they did invest in the ground. And there was a lot of money for a club like Forest. I think they spent about $2.5 million on a brand new stand. And of course, every chairman of a football club says that a new ground or a new stand isn't going to affect their transfer policy. And we all know that's not true.
But I mean, Graham, you kind of alluded to it. I mean, when we talked about Clough at Derby, when he has that kind of that period away where he watches that one single game in the Netherlands, I think, because I mean, Clough is, he's a complex individual, and I think from what I've learned about Brian Clough, the genius, he's deeply insecure, and I think he's quite self-reflective in terms of what he is and how he's represented, and what people think of him as well. For all of his ego, for all of his vocals, I think he's quite an insecure, reflective individual. So I think by the time he gets to Nottingham Forest, he's grown up enough to know that he has to flex. He has to allow the people that are running football teams, which he had a very big problem with in the early days, to do their job, and he does his job. So I think that level of maturity is beneficial to Nottingham Forest when he arrives and takes on this job. And I think he's able to balance what he needs to do to bring success on the football pitch, but also to keep harmony inside the boardroom with the people that are administering the club.
So we get to the following season, 1979, 1980. Now, there is an element to which the wheels start coming off here. That seems harsh to say, given that they get to the final of the League Cup again. This time they lose to Wolves, so they don't make it 3 in a row, and they retain the European Cup.
There's a bit of a misstep, I think, and I think at this point at which Clough starts to wonder whether Taylor is as astute a observer of footballers that he might have been. And I'm thinking particularly of the summer signing. The big summer signing for them was Asa Hartford, who they got from Manchester City for £500,000. And he was there basically to fill a gap with the fallout with Archie Gemmell. Archie Gemmell, I think, had said he was fit enough for the European Cup final, and Clough said he wasn't, and that really upset Archie Gemmell. Because Clough had a bit of a phobia about injuries, probably going back to his own injury. He didn't even like having players around the club who were injured. He'd kind of basically send them away across. So they spent 500,000 on Asa Hartford. Asa Hartford played in 3 games, and Forest won all 3 games, but he was then offloaded to Everton on the grounds that, and it was just 63 days. All he had was 63 days at Forest on the grounds that he didn't suit the style of the club.
Well, I mean, that's the season and a half as Leeds manager, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I think this starts to kind of put doubt a little bit, or drive a little bit of a wedge between Clough and Taylor at this point.
Yeah. Archie Gemmell, I was reading an interview with him, and Clough has basically told him, we don't want you. Asa Hartford's going to be playing from now on. And about a month later, he gets a call from Clough saying, "Oh, come back, we need you. This Hartford chap's no good." And Gemmell goes, "You can't know. No, I'm just going to come back." Interestingly, a little bit later, Ian Bowyer is also shipped out for a year. I suspect, again, that's a Clough thing, and comes back a year later and plays the rest of his career for Forest. Even though he does fall out with some of his regulars, he does like the players he likes.
I think the players love Brian Clough as well. I mean, they may be infuriated by him from time to time. That definitely feels the case. But I think there's an incredible respect. Even when you listen to people like Martin O'Neill now, who will talk about this era, his love and appreciation and respect for Brian Clough is unquestionable. There's incredible admiration and respect for this individual.
I mean, the signings are quite surreal, actually. It's like a series of, think of some of the players who were the most famous in the 70s, who you don't remember playing in the 80s at all, and they came in. So Charlie George, he signs Charlie George. He signs Jim Montgomery. He signs Stan Bowles.
He does, yeah. Stan Bowles for a short time. I mean, he's not there long. I think Stan Bowles spent more time in the bookies than he did at Nottingham Forest. Keep doing that.
He gets the full Asa Hartford treatment.
I wonder if Peter Taylor did his due diligence of Stan Bowles at this point. Maybe again it's a sign of him not quite being on top of things, because surely he would have followed around Stan Bowles.
Yes. So as I say, the season is still, it's still quite successful. They finished 5th in the league. They lose 14 games in that season as opposed to 3 in each of the previous seasons. Tony Woodcock is sold. I think he joins Cologne of all teams. So he's sold in the winter, and they get a lot of money for him. But I think there's probably some of this balancing of the books going on there. Not least because he's playing his £1 million player on the right wing, Trevor Francis.
Although there's also a bit of tension with Trevor Francis, because after winning the European Cup, I think Trevor Francis had agreed to play for Detroit Express in the NASL, but he suffered a groin strain. Yeah, and he came back. It was a slight injury, but Clough took a bit of a huff and said he couldn't play for 6 games, and the PFA had to get involved and broker an agreement between them. He was really quite, maybe understandably, he was kind of quite upset that his £1 million player had gone away, made a lot of money in the States, and got himself injured.
Yeah, it was a popular thing like that.
The season in Europe, though, sort of continues spectacularly well. So, Jamie, you know all about these kind of random tournaments. I think the UEFA Super Cup is a random one, but fair play to Forest, because they're up against Barcelona over 2 legs, and they win that one. So, tick, another bit of silverware, and Forest go on and to have another hugely successful run in the European Cup.
So they beat Osters from Sweden in the first round over 2 legs. They then beat the Romanian team. They played Dynamo Berlin, who was a bit of a big deal back in the late 1970s, Eastern German team. And then they're up against Ajax in the semi-final. Now, this isn't the Ajax that has won 3 European Cups previously in the 1970s, but it's still a pretty decent Ajax. And they come through that one by the odd goal, where they then meet Mighty Mouse and Hamburg in the final. Another team we were familiar with back in our earlier days.
Yeah, great team, this one. Kevin Keegan's inspired, and everything is sort of set up for a narrative for, I think, Kevin Keegan to win that game. This is a great Hamburg side. And this Forest side, it's got a very familiar defence to it. It's Shilton, it's Anderson. Frank Gray's replaced Frank Clough by this stage as left back. Larry Lloyd, Kenny Burns. But that's pretty much the established defence. But it's further up the pitch I find interesting. To my mind, and it's partly because not all these players are holding midfielders, as in my mind they are. But McGovern, Bowyer, O'Neill, Gary Mills, all playing in the midfield there. And then John Robertson and Gary Birtles playing off the top. So without Woodcock, and I'm assuming Francis is injured at this point, attack-wise, there isn't really very much there.
Yeah, but we haven't really talked about it much. And Clough was really of the mindset with this Forest team of give the ball to John Robinson because he was the magic in this team.
So John Robertson's interesting, isn't he? Playing for Forest, he scores 9 goals across his first 5 or 6 seasons, first 6 seasons at Forest. Not playing necessarily that much. And then he pretty much gets, in this peak period, he gets pretty much 9 goals a season at least. So he's at the heart of so much of this Forest side. And his moment comes with the winning goal in that final, and it's a bit of a trademark John Robertson cut in and finish.
So we've got the first European Cup. He beats a defender, puts in a cross, Francis knocks it in. And then he wins the European Cup, or at least gets the winning goal in the next European Cup in 1980, where he just drops his shoulder and kind of cuts in from the left and just kind of curls the ball Tommy Smith-like into the bottom right-hand corner. It was remarkable. And I suppose from the play he had been when Clough had been there, and again, Clough wasn't sure what to make of John Robertson because he was like, he was scruffy and unshaven and, a little bit overweight, maybe not quite looking after himself. To basically creating the goal and then scoring the goal in 2 European Cups is just remarkable.
So unbelievably, Forest have now won 5 trophies, 6 if you count the Anglo-Scottish Cup.
7 Charity Shield,
7
if you count the Charity Shield as well,
8
as it was
count
called.
the European Super Cup within 3 years. Bearing in mind that this is a team that, prior to Brian Clough taking over, had won 2 FA Cups. It obviously also continues a crazy run of European English teams in Europe. So I think this is the 4th year in a 6-year run when English teams win the European Cup.
I think we'd won, so Liverpool do 2, and then followed straight after by 2 Forest European Cups.
Liverpool then beat Real Madrid 1-0. I think that might be the Alan Kennedy goal. And then Aston Villa with Nigel Spinking goal win. And this incredible run of 6 European Cups in a row from English sides, which is pretty crazy. So Forest have won the European Cup. This is sort of the end of the golden period of Brian Clough at Forest. Now, he's there for some time yet to come, but things start to go a little bit astray. They're knocked out in the first round of the European Cup the following season. Some of the signings don't quite come off. Again, more of those star players are leaving. Jim Montgomery leaves. Gary Birtles gets picked off by Man United. By the winter, Martin O'Neill, Ian Bowyer, Larry Lloyd have all left. And the players who come in don't really hit the spot. Peter Ward is an expensive signing, comes in from Brighton. Ian Wallace from Coventry. And then some of those kind of relationships with the key men behind in terms of the coaching stuff, Jimmy Gordon and Peter Taylor start changing, don't they?
There's a fair bit of tension that mounts between Clough and Taylor in, I think it's the 80-81 season. Taylor has a book published. Title is With Clough by Taylor. Taylor had kind of kept the book a bit secret, even though, it's called With Clough, and there's a pictures of both of them sitting on a bench right in the front. It tends to paint, and Jamie, you've mentioned this a little bit, it tends to paint Brian Clough as being a touch insular and quite insecure. Suggests that he's arrogant, and this kind of covers up that kind of insecurity. it's probably true. It's probably quite accurate, but it's also not particularly diplomatic. And then the final problem for Clough is that an awful lot of this book is about Clough, and he doesn't get any of the royalties either.
That would really, really tick him over the edge, I think, tip him over the edge. I think also, I mean, this is a very unique story, not just in English football, I think in the history of the game. Nottingham Forest are, with the greatest respect, a fairly medium-sized, small to medium-sized provincial football club that's for 3 seasons has punched way above their weight. So, they've come into the top league where they haven't really been a regular feature and they've won it. They've then gone on and won 2 European Cups, which is unprecedented. No team of Forest's stature have done that before or after. They're unique in the fact that they've won more European Cups than they have domestic league titles. I think they're the only football team in the world that can boast this incredible fact.
It's brilliant.
It is brilliant. So I think the club is going to struggle to keep up with the success that's happening on the football pitch. I don't believe for any second that Nottingham Forest were prepared for this level of success, and they can't compete with the revenues of a Liverpool at that time, or even a Manchester United at that time that weren't winning domestic titles, weren't winning much at all really under Dave Sexton, but they were still a massive football club with a commercial draw. And I think the weight of that financial burden on Nottingham Forest was too heavy. And I think that would have been the reason why they probably would have started moving players on to balance the books.
I was going to say, I think I 100% agree with that. I think another example of that was when Tony Woodcock goes to Cologne, because I think he trebles his wages when he goes to Cologne. So not only could they not compete with Liverpool and Man United and the commercial revenue they've got, but also kind of continental teams were stealing a march on a club which has invested £2.5 million in a new stand and was getting good attendances. This is before TV money and everything else, or investments from the Saudi investment or other funds. You just couldn't kind of compete.
It would probably be easier for Clough to deal with this if he had Peter Taylor with him.
It's, 80-81 when Taylor moves on, this is the perfect storm. No Taylor, no incredible recruitment. And, Clough for all of his...
Jimmy Gordon has gone by this point as well, I think. Is that right?
Well, Jimmy Gordon wanted to retire prior to taking the Forest job. He was already thinking about retirement when Clough convinced him that it was in his best interest, in Brian Clough's best interest, to stick around for a bit longer. Yeah, so I think, it's a slow erosion of Nottingham Forest, because they do have a spell in the late 1980s and the early 90s where they are competing again. They win a couple of League Cups, they get to the FA Cup final, that one trophy that eluded Brian Clough, where they lose to Tottenham Hotspur. There was an Indian summer for Clough and Forest, but the erosion starts in the early 1980s after this incredible period.
Worth saying, Forest, as you say, they do win a couple more League Cups. They win 11 major tournaments or major cups under Brian Clough's reign. Previously, they've only won 2 FA Cups. They've actually won 13 major tournaments if you also count the Anglo-Scottish Cup and the Football League Centenary Tournament. This is 1988, the centenary year of the Football League, and this is the year in which a whole series of tournaments or events are planned to celebrate the centenary. It begins with the English Football League for the rest of the world game, which we talked about previously. There's something called the Football League Centenary Cup, I think it is, which Arsenal win, and that's a competition between the top 8 Football League teams in the division there. Arsenal beat Man United in the final of that one, I think. And then there's this extraordinary thing called the Football League Centenary Tournament, also known as the Mercantile Football Festival, the Mercantile Credit Football Festival. The original idea of this, and I like this as an idea, was a 2-day weekend at Wembley, and it was going to be basically a 5-side tournament for all 92 teams that everyone got to play at Wembley. They quite quickly realised that wasn't feasible, and so then they changed it They were going to pick 16 teams to play at the tournament, the qualification for which was pretty random, as there was a series of results between January and March which decided your thing, and then they had to work out how to fit this all in. Now, obviously, you can't fit that many games in 90-minute 11-a-side games at Wembley, so they end up having to play 40-minute games, and then a surprise to learn that virtually every game finishes 0-0 and has to be decided on penalties. So almost every game gets decided by penalties. Tranmere are the start of it. Tranmere are in the fourth division, I think, at the time. They get almost through to the final or the semi-final. But Nottingham Forest do get to the final, and they do win that game. How important is that tournament? Well, if I tell you that Brian Clough doesn't even go to the final, so he doesn't go to the second day, maybe this doesn't count. But I was impressed with it, and I think the choice of Mercantile Credit as the sponsor, the only snooker tournament Willie Thorne ever won in his life, tells you everything.
Great reference. That's a brilliant snooker reference. I absolutely applaud you massively for that one. Brilliant.
The only proper ranking tournament that Willie Thorne ever won, or the only major? Right. Well, let's get to ranking this team, and any other stories you want to put in, we'll chuck in after the ranking. As a reminder, we have 5 categories of greatness, from all-time greats to the top. True greats, our middle category of touch of greatness, edge of greatness, and our bottom ranking category of blink of greats. And we also had to invent another one called not necessarily great, but without them we wouldn't be where we are today, for some teams that just defied categorization. As I've done for pretty much the previous 99 episodes, I'm going to start with you, Jamie.
Yeah, I think I know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to justify it quickly. Second division to European champions in 3 years. That's the greatest fairy tale I think there is in football. If you're a football fan, you dream of that. Clough, Taylor and Gordon, an absolute trio of perfection. They cover every base in terms of the unity to manage football. Back-to-back European champions, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's an incredible achievement, especially a team with the resources in Nottingham Forest. They go on a 42 unbeaten game run, which we talked about, which pretty showcases their brilliance and their discipline. The first £1 million signing, Nottingham Forest, Trevor Francis, that showcases the ambition and boldness of this football team at that particular moment. And it's a team built on chemistry, character, belief, psychology. It's not finance. There's a lot of finance involved, but there's so many other things that's driving this team. It's an example of how greatness really can come from anywhere, and it truly comes from anywhere. For me, it's incredible this team have achieved, and I don't only think they're all-time greats. I hold them up there as one of the greatest football teams of all time, and I mean that sincerely.
Phil, are you going to argue him down?
No, I'm not. No, I agree with everything that Jamie just said there. I'm kind of conscious in my first appearance. I tried to make a similar case for Sunderland, but you poo-pooed that unbelievably. That, along with the Arsenal Stadium mystery not being a great movie, is just utterly baffling. But I think it just seems inconceivable that would happen or could happen today. You've had, Leicester, I guess, could be not close-ish. They get promoted, they kind of survive, and then they win the league championship, but then just fall. To kind of go from, with all respect to Nottingham Forest, a mid-tier team with very little success before that, and then to get promoted, to win against a very strong, not just a strong Liverpool team, but there was good teams in that division towards the end of the decade. To do that, win the league, win the European Cup, and to retain the European Cup is just out of the world. I can't think of any kind of comparators to what Forest achieved.
I could just echo everything, but we've already gone on for hours, so it's an absolute no-brainer. Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest, all-time greats. Worth, as you mentioned, I think somewhere along the line, maybe in one of our breaks, Brian Clough is, of course, becomes now it's either the third or the fourth man to do this, to win the top flight with two different clubs. I thought he was the third, but I have seen a fourth person mentioned. So we obviously know that Kenny Dalglish is the last man to achieve that. So he does it with Liverpool and Blackburn. Clough does it with Forest and Derby. Phil, who else does it?
Tommy Watson, not the Tommy Watson, scorer of that goal in the playoff final, but a different Tommy Watson was manager with Sunderland and later Liverpool at the end of the 19th century. And I think the one other manager to have done it is Herbert Chapman with Huddersfield and later Arsenal as well. There should perhaps be a special mention for Alex Ferguson as well, because I think he wins the Scottish League, obviously, with Aberdeen. He wins the Premier League there, but also he won a few Premier League titles, I think.
We've talked statutes before, and I'm curious about this one because I'm not quite sure, but there's a great, so the Taylor-Clough relationship, it's very sad actually that it ends the way it does, and the final straw is Taylor having sort of left Goats and takes over at Derby, and he signs John Robertson, and Clough is particularly annoyed that Taylor doesn't even have the decency to call him. I mean, if I was Peter Taylor, I know why I wouldn't be calling him to mention that. I think we'd have all done. I mean, it'd be different now. You'd send a text, wouldn't you, and just be done with it. But Clough afterwards in tabloid article says, describes him as a rattlesnake. We pass each other on the A52 going to work on most days of the week, but if his car broke down and I saw him throwing a lift, I wouldn't pick him up. I'd run him over. The irony is, on that road, he's going from one ground with statues of Brian Clough and Peter Taylor to another ground, and I don't know if the City Ground has them both or if it's just Brian Clough, but there would be an irony.
I think there are 4 statues. Are there 2 statues of Clough in Nottingham, one in Derby and one in Middlesbrough as well, in Albert Park as well, very close to where he lived, just north of where he lived and just south of where Don Revie also lived, because ironically they were both Borough lads. Didn't quite see eye to eye, but they were both Borough lads.
Never picked up on that. Never picked up on the fact they didn't get on. I think about you all the time when I think about Brian Clough, because you talked about the Derby County chairman, whose name escapes me right now. Who, Phil, you always say you can't help but picture Jim Broadbent, which I referenced earlier today. I have the same problem with Peter Taylor. I see Timothy Spall all of the time. I only see him as Peter Taylor, the guy from Alvise St. Pet. That's the man in my head. And, saying to Brian Clough in that kind of withery tone, well, we were happy at Brighton, Brian.
Phil, when you look back at some of those great Sunderland teams, are you worried you're only going to see Steve Coogan doing Mick McCarthy?
So,
right.
Graham, before we wrap up, I just want to point out something that's quite unique. This is our 100th episode, clearly, which is something we referenced. You may have popped out at the beginning. But you know what? In the sequence of the teams that we've ranked now, Brazil 82, Italy 82, and now Nottingham Forest 77-80, we've ranked all 3 in a row as all-time greats, which is something we steered away from at the beginning. We kind of like to average ourselves in touch and jump into the bucket. Next week, do you think there's a chance that we could make it 4 in a row?
Well, we've got a few teams that we're lining up. One of them is the Harry Redknapp Bournemouth team that dumps Man United out of the FA Cup in about the mid-80s. Now, well, the question is, Jamie, whether either of those sides could be all-time greats, because not only are we doing the Bournemouth side that dumps Ron Atkinson's Man United out of the FA Cup, we are also next week going to be doing Ron Atkinson's Man United. You heard it here first. Edge of greatness.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely full disclosure. I mean, I can't even argue with that. But I will argue with that.
Phil, thank you so much for this week and for the honour, I don't know if it is an honour, of being our most regular guest. Take that as you will.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy football and history combined together. So I'm in dreamland. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Jamie, here's to another 100.
Absolutely. Here's to another 100. And thank you again, Phil. Are an absolute treasure chest of a guest to have on. I do love sharing football and history with you. But Graham, I also want to just thank everyone who's taken the effort to download and listening to a couple of old blokes with a few friends every now and then talking about old football teams. So thank you so much to those who have kept us with the purpose of doing this, all four of you.
Yes, here, totally agree. We will be back with podcast number 101 next week. Ron Atkinson's Manchester United.